MSW Media.
Spy Talk, a podcast at the intersection of intelligence, foreign policy, national security, and military operations.
Hi there, I'm Jeff Stein. This is Spy Talk. William D. Bill Murray is one of our most distinguished CIA veterans, a former station chief and division head and senior operations official for many years. Bill's career arc spanned the Cold War with the Soviets, to the Balkans conflict with Serbia, through the 9/11 attacks and counterterrorism campaigns against the likes of Al-Qaeda. He's done it all. Today, Bill is a founding board member of the Council on Intelligence Issues, a key mission of which, it says, is to educate the public on intelligence issues and challenges. There's no shortage of CIA challenges today, to say the least, from the escalating violence of Russian intelligence services in Europe to Chinese espionage here, to the Trump administration's shocking U-turn on NATO and apparent surrender of Ukraine to Vladimir Putin. Bill Murray, my old friend, welcome to Spy Talk. It's great to see you and talk to you. You've been at this business a long time. We were going to start talking, when we talked last week, we said, let's talk about this muscular new profile that Moscow has adopted in terms of sabotage operations and so forth against the West. And then these startling developments happened over the weekend and the beginning of this week where Trump did a U-turn on, Trump and his acolytes did a U-turn on NATO, bypassed the German chancellor to talk to the right-wing AfD party, and apparently are preparing to abandon Ukraine. There's a war of words, extraordinary, between Trump and Volodymyr Zelensky. So we seem to be upending 80 years of the bedrock of U.S. policy, where the U.S. Atlantic Alliance, NATO, EU, and so on was the foundation, our protection of European democracies, and that seems to be in play right now. So I was wondering, from your long experience with the agency and U.S. intelligence in general, how do you think, is there a shockwave going through the corridors now at CIA headquarters, or is it like, oh, well, this is politicians mouthing off again and we just go about our work? What do you think?
It's hard for me to tell. I've been out for quite a while now, but I imagine there's a shockwave going through, a lot of discussion, a lot of what this means, et cetera, et cetera. You know, the workforce, frankly, Jeff, is very different from what you and I dealt with when we first entered this business.
For sure.
People don't just salute and do what they're told anymore. They start making what I would call careerist decisions on where they want to go and what they want to do, and et cetera.
Yeah.
But, you know, the reality is, no matter what we decide about Russia and how, you know, we don't need to pay much attention to them, and we don't need to pay much attention to NATO and all the rest of it. There's a few things that are reality. The first reality is that Americans are still primarily derived from a European people, and we have strong ties with Europe, whether we like it or not. And we may decry European policies and everything else, but eventually they are our cousins. And our demography is changing, yes, but even if you look at, you know, the demography, which is increasingly becoming Hispanic, they are ultimately mainly from a European culture. Their cultures are European, with some admixture.
So these are long cultural ties that are in our DNA of our political relationships with Europe.
They're not going to go away, okay? And the other thing is, we may decide that Russia's not important to us, but that doesn't mean the Russians are going to leave us alone. So we're either going to just allow them to do whatever they want, or we're going to be constantly on a defensive footing.
I think what you're suggesting is that there's going to be a swing back from this radical position, and there's no other way to describe it, this radical U-turn that Trump and company are taking in regard to Europe. There'll eventually be a swing back because our ties are too strong, too binding over the centuries, really.
Yeah, well, I also don't think that America is going to sit by and watch Russia take over Europe or reconstitute the Soviet Empire, which is Putin's objective. He's said it since he took power, that his objective is to reconstitute the Soviet Union, that he thought that the dissolution of the Soviet Union was the greatest political catastrophe of the 20th century, and he wants to reverse that. And that's exactly what he's doing. So, no matter how this plays out, Ukraine, eventually Moldova, Poland, etc., the Baltic states are particularly vulnerable to Russian aggression. The Russians aren't going to stop, and we're going to have to deal with it one way or the other. Whether we want to or whether any administration wants to or not, we are ultimately going to have to deal with it.
Yeah, that's the consensus. People who are alarmed about this is that Ukraine is just one bite, that the Russians are going to continue to try to subvert other U.S. allies in the region. They're just not going to stop.
Of course.
It's interesting. There's some of the objection to the Trump U-turn on NATO and new friendship with Vladimir Putin. It seems to be centered on what's going to happen to Europe. It's not what's going to happen to America. We're hearing conservative Republicans sort of starting to mumble aloud, saying, "Well, we don't want to abandon Europe," and that seems to be a point of dissension. How big it is too soon to tell.
Well, we always want to think that we're somehow protected by two oceans, and we can have a completely isolationist foreign policy and be totally self-reliant. But the reality is, Europe is the front door to America. I mean, I spent, as you know, many years of my life fighting terrorists, and terrorists come to the United States primarily through European travel from the Middle East, but through Europe. That's going to continue. We're always going to have a need to have strong ties to European nations because we work with them on all of these issues, and they work with us.
That brings up another question. Do you have any guesses? And these are just guesses now because stuff is so early and so quickly developing. Do you have any guesses on how European allied intelligence services are looking at this and whether they're going to be cautious about what they're going to tell the Americans?
No.
And what degree of cooperation will continue?
Well, they're not happy with us right now. That's pretty obvious. I don't think it's going to change the intelligence cooperation all that much.
Okay.
Because they rely on us, and to a certain extent, we rely on them. I mean, we always want to think we can do it all alone, but then we need bases overseas. We need transit rights. We need overflight rights. We need the right to move our ships in time of war or whatever, or emergency. We need critical supplies and materials that comes through European ports. We just can't deny those ties and the necessity. And behind all of that is vibrant intelligence cooperation on the part of us and all of the European countries.
It's a mutual interest to stop terrorist attacks.
Exactly.
So that's not going to change.
Exactly. Stop terrorism and stop other things that destabilize Europe, because eventually they'll destabilize the United States.
Well, let's move on to that, which is one of the things we were going to focus on last week.
Exactly.
the scenery has changed. But let's move on to that. There have been a lot of reports recently that Russia has developed an entirely new division to attack the West with sabotage and gray zone activities and so on. Do you have any thoughts offhand of how we might muscle up to counteract that?
Well, first of all, what the Russians or what the Soviets used to call active measures is a fundamental part of Russian diplomatic and political and intelligence activity from the time of the Tsars. It's never changed. It's not going to change. It doesn't matter who's in charge in Moscow. Russians really believe in using active measures. Americans don't. Okay, we've had a few periods in our history when active measures were in vogue, The last period when they were really in vogue was probably when Bill Casey was a director under President Reagan, and Casey very much believed in them.
And we, for example, covert aid to the Polish Solidarity movement.
Yeah, and the whole war in Afghanistan and all the rest of that.
That too. Yep.
But there were also all kinds of activities that Bill Casey was interested in. And the minute he died, or the minute he left the agency, actually, all of that activity stopped, because it's never, ever popular with our intelligence leaders, frankly, because it's always the thing that gets the intelligence agencies in trouble. So people,
it is risky. It's very risky. Exposure is risky, and so on. There's questions about how useful it is, depending on the operation. But let's talk about this escalation on the Russian side. We've gotten reports now that they're sabotaging DHL planes. I mean, that seems like a significant escalation.
Yeah, it is. They tried it. They experimented with it. Whether they're going to actually do it operationally in the future, only who knows.
And assassinations.
The assassinations. There's a group of graduate students actually who've been following the assassination thing, and I think you can get some material through studies in intelligence on what they've rounded up. But the assassinations have been going on now for as long as Putin's been in office. It's just repeated assassinations, attempts at assassination, and they're now numbering in the hundreds. And they're all over the world, so including various attempts in the United States.
Is there a way for us to signal back in a very muscular way to use some of these same methods against Russia? I mean, we have, a lot of stipulations, regulations, cultural changes, the difference in our system and theirs about what we can do. We don't go out and do assassinations around the world, at least anymore. We have of terrorist leaders. That's a different sphere. But against the Russians, would we sabotage? Why don't we just put it out there? Would we sabotage a Russian transport plane to say, "Hey, we can play the game too"?
No, we'd never do that. No, we American forces, intelligence agencies, etc., cannot conduct any kind of lethal operation or provide lethal equipment to anybody without a presidential finding, without a memorandum of notification to Congress. There's an entire process that would have to take place there. And certainly none of that has taken place. I mean, we would be hearing about that if any president tried to do it. It would be in the news the next day.
Do you regret that? Do you think? I mean, you're an old Cold Warrior, if you don't mind my saying so.
No, I don't mind it at all. I'm the title fits, Jeff.
You wish we could do that?
And Cold Warrior.
Both of us. We're cut from the same cloth, exactly. I'm afraid. So do you regret that? Do you think we should be able to up our game?
Not really. One of the things I always tried to teach people who were working for me, or when I was giving lectures or whatever in the agency, was don't ever do anything that you don't want your mother to read about in the Washington Post. And, the bottom line is don't do things that are incompatible with our values and our culture. Blowing up an airplane is totally incompatible with American culture, American tradition, American law, our sense of morality, all of it. No, I never regretted anything like that. I do think we should do more and should have done more over the years in our own form of active measures against the Russians and against others. But I think a lot of that was just simply because we didn't have the people and we don't do it very well. And political leaders don't like it, and American political leaders are always looking for immediate results, and you don't get immediate results through that kind of operation. Those kind of operations take a long time, and sometimes they have results, and sometimes they have very few results.
We have to step away for a minute. We'll be back in a sec. Okay, we're back with Bill Murray. Well, let's talk about the kind of thing, people who are not intimately familiar with this subject. What are the kind of things of covert action that we can do? We're not talking about coup d'etats here, by the way. They were, proliferating during the 1950s in particular. But there's a theater of operations below that in which we use to discredit our enemies, in particular Russia over the long Cold War, and to some degree China. For example, there was a case when the CIA helped disrupt a burgeoning relationship between, well, let's just say a major country in the North Africa, Middle East region. And CIA launched a covert action program to bust that up. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I think I know what you're.
Or how that was done.
I think I know what you're referring to, and it was through the use of the publication of a KGB telegram, which was an internal KGB telegram providing instructions to KGB referentura in another country, telling them how they were going to go about subverting the local Communist Party to use it for their own purposes. And it came out in the press and et cetera, with some assistance. It came out in the press and it had an immediate effect, not just in that country, but in many of the surrounding countries in the Horn of Africa and parts of the Middle East.
Was that a real document the CIA stole and publicized, or was that something we made up and put into the press?
I'm not sure what I'm allowed to comment on that. Let's just say that it was certainly taken to be genuine at the time.
Okay, so that was let's say, a good disruptive relationship about the Russian subversion to try to derail Russian subversion in the Middle East. North Africa. Let's talk about other kinds of things that you can do. I mean, one of the things very traditional is you try to discredit a Russian official.
Yeah, you do denigration campaigns, whether you use a rumor mill or whether you plant documents or maybe put some money into a guy's bank account and then tell his masters that the money's there. And by the way, it came from the West. Those kinds of techniques have been used by intelligence agencies for probably as long as there have been intelligence organizations.
That was dramatized. That was dramatized in The Spy Who Came In from the Cold,
exactly.
Which the movie version of which I just watched again the other night, and it really holds up. But that was a deception operation to discredit, on the one hand, to discredit one particular Russian intelligence officer and to protect another who was working for the Brits in this case.
Probably. So, I mean, if you look at World War II, for example, Operation Mincemeat, which was designed to make sure that the Germans were convinced that we were going to invade Greece. That whole thing with the so-called man who never was, a dead body that was floated ashore in Spain, knowing that the Spanish would give the documents around the body to the Gestapo, which they did, and Hitler believed them. So he moved planes, heavy bombers, and other equipment out of Sicily into Greece, thinking that the American Navy was going to Greece next. They didn't. We went to Sicily and had a very successful invasion of Sicily. We still had to deal with German aircraft in Sicily, but not in the numbers that we would have had to deal with if they hadn't sent bomber squadrons to Greece. It's very poignant to me because my father was in that invasion fleet.
Let's just do a thought experiment here. So if you're running covert operations at CIA, you're the director of CIA, and you say, we got to undermine Russian politics, Russian subversion campaign, muscled up subversion campaign against Western Europe, sabotaging THL planes and all the internal stuff they're doing in Moldova and other places. And if you wanted to push them back, what kind of things would you think about doing? Just throwing out, spitballing.
Well, the first would be denigration operations. You identify the officials that are involved in a campaign like that and try to destroy their reputations, try to give them something to react to and worry about, and get them away from their jobs, or get their masters to question their competence or their loyalty or whatever. That technique, by the way, is particularly effective against autocratic regimes where you have very small numbers of people at the top because they're all vying for power. They're vying for the ear of the leader, and they're in competition with one another. You start fooling around with the reputation of one, and it can have ramifications throughout the whole leadership.
So, like you say, one technique would be like you pump some money into an official's account, or you create a fictitious bank account for some high Russian official, put money into it, and then somehow let Russian counterintelligence know, or to hint that they should be looking into this guy.
Yeah.
So that's one technique.
Yeah, or create a record of a meeting, for example, which may be completely fictitious, that the official had with some Western power on a recent trip, or whatever, and then the guy's got to go home and explain it. And of course, all he can say is, "Well, I didn't do that." Well, here's the documents that show you were in Italy and you met with so and so, and blah blah blah. We have a picture of you in a cafe. I mean, there are things you can do like that. You can also use to a limit. It used to be that you could use the press, at least to a certain degree. But today, I don't think the press is half as effective as social media. You get into the social media and do to them what they've been doing to us for so long, creating fake accounts,
for example,
creating false organizations, feeding material to organizations inside those powers, whether it be Russia or Iran or whoever, that are already in dispute with one another, exacerbate their difficulties, exacerbate their differences with one another, widen any cleavages that already exist, create straw man problems for them to solve. They're doing all of this to us right now. China, Iran, and Russia are all doing this to us every day. I mean, I don't even know how many accounts. I lost track of it. I was actually keeping track of it for a while, but there's been thousands of Facebook accounts and other accounts that have been closed because the people who run those organizations have discovered that they were totally fictitious, that they were fictitious organizations or fictitious people, probably coming from external powers. So, yeah, social media is great.
Yeah, they proliferate on X and in LinkedIn. I have people reaching out to me, want to be connected to me in a totally false accounts.
Oh, yeah. I'm seeing that. I'm seeing more and more of that. And it's always a very attractive looking young woman who's the senior manager or vice president of something that is not further identified. And if you look it up, you can't find any evidence that the organization even exists. I suspect most of those are coming from China.
Do you have any feeling, general feeling? I know you've been out for a long time, but there's the Langley TomTom network. Do you have any feeling that we've been active enough as we should have been against to counter Russian subversion?
No, I don't.
Or give them some of their own medicine.
No, we don't have the expertise any longer. We literally got rid of it. We just, if you look at it, at the 10 years or so that we've spent on the war on counterterrorism, those organizations were ripe for this kind of operation. And it's our footprint is missing because we weren't doing anything. We were trying.
What do you mean they were ripe? They were ripe to be
those
used
organizations.
They
were, they're out looking. They're trying to recruit people. So you get into the recruitment channels. You get into the documents and the publications that they put out through social media, and then you begin to destroy them internally. What we would do is just try to figure out where they are and then close them down. So then they open up, on a different site the next day. And that's not as effective as giving them something else to do, like defending themselves or trying to figure out what's wrong or why are their operations falling apart or why so many of their recruits are actually don't exist.
You have to break that down for me, not to mention the audience here. What do you mean about?
Well, I would create a counter organization. For example, you have Al Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, so you create Al Qaeda in the upper part of the Arabian Peninsula, and you draw people off into that. They think they're in Al Qaeda, they're in your organization, and they're going nowhere because you're not going to take them anywhere.
And we have I think there's been reporting on that through the years that we have done some
a bit of it, not enough. We didn't do enough. I can tell all during the war against terrorism, we just didn't do enough of it. those, all of those organizations, their biggest weakness was they needed external recruiting. They needed recruiting from around the world. They needed people who could pass and operate in Western countries, and they were few and far between.
We didn't do enough of it because we didn't have the resources. There wasn't interest or will to do it. What?
I don't think the people who were in charge of those operations in those years had any idea what they were doing.
Wow, that's quite an indictment.
Why?
Because they didn't know Arab cultures?
I'm not trying to blame the people. It's just we had lost that technique over the years. We'd lost the tradition and the technique. We went almost automatically in the war against terrorism to lethal operations. It became the global war on terrorism, and it became a Pentagon problem. Okay, and with the agency basically and the intelligence community providing targets.
Now, in regard to Russia and China, the hard targets, someone I was talking to this morning actually, who said you were his first boss many years ago, told me, he said, the war on counterterrorism took our eyes off the technology ball, that we didn't spend enough time countering Russian and Chinese surveillance techniques and so on with our own technological development of the countermeasures and so on, because we were so engaged in counterterrorism.
That's true. And that's what I told this guy probably, 20 years ago?
He was remarking about where we are today, and he was saying that I was asking him about, as I've been asking others, does the new Trump U-turn on NATO and so on affect people in our Russian operations? Will we curtail them and so on? He said, well, they've been curtailing for some time because employees have more of a say right now, and have for the last 20 years or so, on what they want to do with their future. So before, they saluted and took orders, and now a guy might say, well, I don't want to uproot my family and move to Moscow. It's a hard place to live, blah, 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 hard operations. So it's not anything to do with Trump. It has to do with that Russia has become a harder and harder target, a very difficult place to live, much less operate. I mean, the KGB and its successors have been so brutal in the way they respond to our officers in Moscow. I mean, they'll break into an apartment and shit on the kitchen table and say, we were here.
They've been doing that. They did that all during the Cold War, too. I mean, But, the reality, Jeff, is you don't recruit Russians in Russia. You recruit them outside. You recruit them basically in the third world, where they tend to stand out and where they tend to look for people that they can talk to.
Or maybe even here. We had a number of the reported notable recruitments of Russians who were essentially walk-ins that the FBI and the CIA recruited. Someone was saying to one of my writers that it is a bad idea to allow, as Trump wants to do, allow the Russians to refill their embassy here, expand their embassy. We don't want more Russian intelligence officers here. Well, this person I just talked to before we talked, they said, no, there's more targets too. Send over more intelligence officers, give us more opportunities to recruit them or to try to recruit them. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I agree with that to a certain degree. But also, let me go back to your point about walk-ins. If you look at the history of walk-ins, a lot of them were not really walk-ins. They were guys who had studied us. They knew what they wanted. They had a point. They had a problem of some kind. And they would walk in at a point when they were sure that they knew who they were dealing with and how they were going to be treated. Because we'd met them before. We talked to them before in most cases. And they may have rejected us, but at some point in their career, they decide, no, it's time for me to change. The first man who interviewed me when I was trying to get into the agency turned out to have been chief of station in Helsinki, or chief in Helsinki years ago. And he had arrived in Helsinki, and he found that he was being surveilled constantly everywhere he went by the Soviet people from the Soviet embassy, KGB officers, to the point where he was thinking of writing a message back home and saying, I think I need to leave here. I don't think I can be effective. And every morning he used to go out on the back porch and pick up his milk, bring it in, sit and have a cup of coffee. So he opened the porch one Saturday morning, and there was the KGB resident with his entire family. And he said, "You have 24 hours to get me out of the country." The Soviet resident had ordered all of his officers on this guy because he wanted to see if the guy ran secure operations. And once he was sure of it, he defected to the United States.
That's a great story for a novel.
It was a novel. It was the Topaz novel. It was the beginning of Topaz.
Huh. Ever have anything happen with you like that?
I can't really talk about it, Jeff.
Well, in general, some
say
KGB ever show up?
I've had my little escapades over the years. I've had my baptism of fire with the Soviets.
So some KGB officer KGB officer just show up out of the blue on your doorstep?
Almost out of the blue. Almost out of the blue. Not quite out of the blue, but almost. The funny part is he had surveilled my wife and my family because he knew the car had belonged to another officer, and he thought that the woman driving the car might be the replacement. And it wasn't. It just happened to be my wife. But we later became good friends.
Would you advise young people? Let's talk about this DEI stuff that's going on now. I know you have strong feelings about that. We've talked about that over the past. But it seems to be, the CIA began making a very colorful pitch to college students and so on, saying, with Black and Asian and other Hispanic faces and so on, saying, we need people like you in the agency because we need to have all sorts of people that we can deploy around the world, not just, white men. So, and they're going to wipe out all that kind of recruiting stuff, I guess, every trace of anything like that. What do you think of that?
Well, first of all, I'm from the Directorate of Operations, so I focus on what you need to be a case officer, what you need to be an operations officer. And you can be any color and any shape and any gender. You just have to be good at it. You just have to be a good operations officer. You'd have to have the human qualities to be a good operations officer. And so it never mattered to me what anybody was, and it shouldn't matter to anybody what they are, okay? But specifically targeting people for gender or for race or whatever, it's just silly, okay? It doesn't, it's not, it doesn't enhance the intelligence mission. You should be looking for good case officers. That's what you should be looking for.
I asked someone else about this today, a veteran CIA operations official, and he said, he put it in different wording, but he said what we should be recruiting for is not, people of Chinese ancestry or Hispanic or whatever. He said we should be recruiting for languages.
Languages, exactly. And that's
what we want.
All during my career, that's been one of the weak points in the agency, I think, and it continues to be the weak point. Because you talked earlier about the current generation and their likes and dislikes. None of them want to go to school for 3 years to learn Chinese, or maybe a year or more to learn Russian, okay, or 3 years to learn Arabic.
I spent 47 weeks, 6 hours a day learning Vietnamese.
How much good did that do you, Jeff?
Actually, I was pretty good at it. But just an aside here, my first night in Da Nang on an assignment, I was taking over a unilateral collection operation against the North Vietnamese Army. And there was a party at the U.S. consulate that my teammates and I invited me to. So we went there, and, here I am, a bushy-tailed kid, just come right from language school. Before that, I went to case officer course. And so the South Vietnamese colonel, sidles up to me, and we get talking, and I start talking to him in Vietnamese. And he said, "Oh, you're a spook."
Exactly.
So anyway, an advertising campaign along the same lines as this other former officer was saying, maybe the kind of advertisement to be put in the student paper at Cornell or whatever should be in Chinese and with English at the bottom saying, "Can you read this? And if you can, we're looking for you at CIA," or Arabic, or Amharic or Russian. You know, if you can read this, we want to talk to you.
Exactly. I'm all for it. And we don't have a good record of training Americans in foreign languages. It used to be an absolute requirement in the agency, at least in the Directorate of Operations, that by the end of your second tour, you had to have operationally mastered one foreign language. I'm not sure that's even still in force. I've met people who've been through their entire career and never acquired a foreign language.
It was a requirement when I was in high school, and this is 1,000 years ago, that, you know, if you were on the college prep course, you had to take the languages. Usually it was starting with Latin, and then you took either French or Spanish.
Yeah, some of us stuck with the Latin for years.
I did. I ended actually taking 3 years of Latin.
I took 4.
I'm not sure it helped, but I can recite the first line of the Aeneid, and that's about it.
Amac vorumque cano torreque primus aboris.
Bene. Very good, Bill. Anyways, always a pleasure to talk to you. Get your deep, long expertise and facility for this whole subject, and you're a good American, is what I say.
Well, thank you very much, Jeff, and so are you. And it's been a pleasure, and it's been a pleasure knowing you all of these years and dealing with you.
Likewise. Thanks. These are really important issues we're talking about. You know, we've had a little fun talking about them, but boy, this is as challenging a time as I can remember from the early 1960s and the Cuban Missile Crisis and things like that. I think I was saying maybe this is, you know, our grandparents went through Munich in 1938, you know, a hinge moment in history. And I think we're looking at a hinge moment in history right now. And it's nightmarish to actually live through it ourselves, and never thought it would happen again. But here we are.
Let me say one thing about that. I remain optimistic in the same sense that I remained optimistic over the years about people like Gaddafi, because people would say, well, we ought to pay more attention to him or whatever. And I would say, just wait. He'll do something really egregious and stupid, and he'll get the attention he deserves. The Russians will do something egregious and stupid and get the attention they deserve from America.
From your lips to Allah's ear. Thanks for coming on the show, Bill. It's great.
Take care, Jeff. Thank you.
And that's it for this week's Spy Talk. Thanks much for listening. You can find lots more interesting conversations like this one in our archives, available at our home at the MSW Network or on Apple or wherever you get your podcasts. And if you haven't already, mosey on over to our Spy Talk newsletter on Substack, where my colleagues and I offer fresh reporting and analyses from the intersection of intelligence, foreign policy, and military operations. Just Google Spy Talk and you'll find your way there. This week's Spy Talk podcast was smoothly produced, as always, by Kanai and expertly edited by Molly Hockey for MSW Media. That's it. I'm Jeff Stein. See you around.
For more original reporting and insights like this, subscribe to spytalk.co on Substack and follow us on Twitter at @talk_spy. If you enjoyed our podcast, subscribe and leave a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.
MSW Media.